What's Your Story? An exploration of storytelling and social work. What comes to mind when I say storytelling? Maya Angelou said, "There's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you." Brene Brown thinks maybe stories are just data with a soul. She also says that owning our story and loving ourselves through that process is the bravest thing we'll ever do. And an example when we might use storytelling in social work is with a client who identifies as LGBTQIA+, especially with youth or anyone in their coming out process. Having time and space to tell your coming out story is a very therapeutic aspect of the coming out process. The more someone can be accepted through this story and really heard, the more that person can create a positive and strong sense of self. People want to tell their stories. Sometimes they just need the arena and an opportunity. Does anyone remember this? A semicolon is used when an author could have chosen to end their sentence but chose not to. The author is you, and the sentence is your life. The tattoo idea originated from a nonprofit movement called Project Semicolon, which was started by a woman to honor her father who died by suicide. She did this as a way to give voice to her own fight with mental illness. The semicolon tattoo has been around since 2013 and, in my opinion, is still working to change the stigma around suicide. Has anyone ever heard of use of self in social work? I have this tattoo, and to tell you the story, I got it right between the number 11 and 11, which was my best friend Dee Dee's birthday and also the last day when I saw her live. See what I did there? If this were a therapeutic relationship, that is called use of self. And in social work, that specifically means to combine knowledge, values, and skills gained in social work education with aspects of one's personal self, including personality traits, belief systems, life experiences, and cultural heritage. This is what allows social workers to be authentic and genuine with the clients we serve. And to unpack this further, or to add a disclaimer per se, our use of self does not mean full on self disclosure with rough edges. It means if you combine your educational knowledge with some practice wisdom, your life experience, and you have done the work, so your story isn't led by emotion and therefore self serving, then you might use a story from your life to connect with a group, explain a concept to an individual, or address an entire community. Like, for example, sometimes to teach a concept. TED Talks. How many times have we used TED Talks in our personal life and our professional life? The man who said this quote, "The one thing that all great TED speakers have in common is that they are master storytellers," Akash Karia, he trains people to deliver dynamic TED Talks. I'm wondering, as a social worker, if you were to give a TED Talk, what would it be about? So, this is the game changing statement of the year. And it comes from Brene Brown's Call to Courage documentary that can be actually found on Netflix right now. And that's the story I'm telling myself. So, let's say you're in a fight with a partner and you just want to say, "Ugh, I feel like you hate me." Instead of saying that, which probably will cause some feelings, um, detach yourself or detach the other person from that, and tell them, "The story that I'm telling myself right now is that you hate me. And now I know that's not rational, but that's what I'm telling myself. And I think you know where I'm coming from." And that typically will be able to get your point across while diffusing those cognitive distortions we often fall into. So, First Nation, Inuit, and Metis cultures have long passed on knowledge from generation to generation through oral traditions, including storytelling. Storytelling is a traditional method used to teach about cultural beliefs, values, customs, rituals, history, practices, relationship, and ways of life. First Nations storytelling is a foundation for holistic learning, relationship building, and experiential learning. This type of storytelling involves expert use of the voice, vocal and body expression, intonation, and use of verbal imagery, facial animation, context, plot and character development, natural pacing of the telling, and careful, authentic recall of the story. The most important qualities of our culture are our language and our stories. In oral traditions such as ours, telling stories is how we pass on the history and the teachings of our ancestors. Without these stories, we would have to rely on other people for guidance and information about our past. Teachings in the form of stories are an integral part of our identity as a people and as a nation. If we lose these stories, we will do a disservice to our ancestors, those who gave us the responsibility to keep our culture alive. Now we're going to watch a little story.
Long ago, the great mystery, or Kichi-Manitou, sent a great flood. Many of the animals drowned, but there was one man, Wisakejak, who survived on a small island with some animals. They worked together to build a great canoe. They rowed the big canoe for many days. One day the rain stopped, but Wisakejak realized he had forgotten to bring along a piece of the earth to recreate a new world. The only way to get a piece of earth was to dive to the bottom of the ocean. Wisakejak tied a vine to the Kichiamik, a giant beaver, and told him to dive to the depths of the water for some earth. They waited and waited. Finally, Wisakejak pulled up the exhausted Kichiamik, but there was no earth. Next, he told Ningig, the otter, to dive for the earth, but the same thing happened. Finally, the Wajusk, or muskrat, offered to try. Wisakejak lowered the vine, and the muskrat went down and down, further into the ocean. He was down so long, all the other animals thought for sure he was dead. They pulled his lifeless body into the canoe. Wajusk was dead, but inside his tiny paw, he clutched a tiny piece of earth. The muskrat had sacrificed his life so that life on Earth could start again. And then Turtle came forward and offered to bear the weight of this piece of earth so it can grow. Suddenly, the wind blew from the 4 directions, and the tiny piece of earth on the turtle's back began to grow. It grew and grew until it formed an island in the water. After a while, the 4 winds ceased to blow, and the waters became still. A huge island sat in the middle of the water, and today that island is known as North America, the land the First Nations have lived on for thousands of years.
The history of social work with First Nations people is steeped in the legacy of colonialism and assimilation. The reservation system was created to physically isolate First Nations people, and the residential school system was a tool that furthered this isolation by attempting to eradicate the language, traditions, and Indigenous knowledge that is critical for their survival of culture. The mass removal and relocation of children, along with the abuse and maltreatment that occurred systemically at the schools, amounts to cultural genocide, the effects of which have impacted the physical, emotional, spiritual, and economic well being of people for generations that followed. The mass apprehension of First Nations children that followed the closure of residential schools furthered the colonial agenda. And the social work profession was intimately involved in this mass scooping of children starting in the 1960s. Currently, First Nations children continue to be overrepresented in the child welfare system, and so the social work profession also continues to act as agents of colonialism and oppression. Cindy Blackstock argues that the social work profession insulates itself by rationalizing its past and contemporary history of injustice by the propensity to believe that if we were all well intended in our actions, regardless of consequences, social workers are substantially absolved from moral responsibility. She says social workers must be aware of the context of this history, as their First Nations clients are likely to have experienced the impacts of these interactions, either directly or intergenerationally. So music often has a meaningful story attached. Gord Downie, who passed away in 2017, was an activist who spent his last days after learning he had terminal brain cancer trying to reach Canadians with the story of Chanie Wenjack, the Anishinaabe boy from Ontario who ran away from his residential school at age 12 and subsequently died from hunger and exposure to the harsh weather. Chanie Wenjack's death in 1966 sparked national attention, and it led to the first inquest into the treatment of Indigenous children in Canadian residential schools. So you might be wondering, why should we care about this in social work? The history of social work with Indigenous people is steeped in the legacy of colonialism and assimilation. We joined a profession that played a large role in damaging so many people. So we owe the people, at the very least, to be aware of the history so we can strive not to play a role in further damage. And I'm just going to play a little video that talks about the Gord Downie and Chanie Wenjack Foundation.
My Uncle Chanie was one of over 150,000 Indigenous children that were taken to residential schools between the 1800s and 1996. My uncle ran away from school wanting to get home to his mom and dad, and sadly he didn't make it and died of exposure. When Gord Downie found out about my late Uncle Chanie's story, he wrote Secret Path, a series of poems that became an album, then a graphic novel, a documentary, and a concert. Gord met my family, and together we formed the Gord Downie and Chanie Wenjack Fund. Together we are sharing Secret Path and other reconciliation resources with legacy schools, setting up legacy spaces across Canada, and hosting events like Secret Path Week to inspire all Canadians to engage in reconciliation. Before he left us, Gord asked us all to do something. You're gonna figure it out. Will you join us? Together we can make Canada a better place.
So I have to say that, full disclosure here, Gord Downie is probably my favorite Canadian that ever lived. Gord Downie was also the lead singer for the Tragically Hip, a very popular Canadian band, who are known for singing about real life events. Like, for example, their song Wheat Kings is about David Milgaard, a man who served 23 years in jail after being wrongfully convicted of the rape and murder of a nursing assistant named Gail Miller. David Milgaard's conviction was eventually overturned, and the Tragically Hip sang Wheat Kings to a free David Milgaard at a concert. There's so many times in social work that we can draw on music like this to educate or to help groups feel some kind of solidarity. Just as an example, in the community at Windsor Youth Center, they have a music studio, and it does follow, I believe it does follow a positive youth development model. So so in this way, music is a protective factor for youth who, for example, might be experiencing homelessness, or who might use drugs, or who possibly have some risk factors to go in that direction. So music can definitely be a really important protective factor for some of our clients. Another way that we can use storytelling in social work is through narrative therapy, because the way you tell your story to yourself really does matter. For those not familiar with narrative therapy, it's a style of therapy that helps people become and embrace being an expert in their own lives. In narrative therapy, there's an emphasis on the stories we develop and carry with us through our lives. The focus is around the stories that we develop and give that we give meaning to our personal experiences, and then these meanings that we come up with or have been placed on us by others influence how we see ourselves in the world around us. Narrative therapy is concerned with our stories, which are believed to influence our thoughts and in turn our decision making and behaviors. Narrative therapy is based on the following principles. One, that reality is socially constructed. So the way we interact with others impacts how we experience reality. These experiences with others become our known reality. Number two is reality is influenced by and communicated through language. Language is so important. People interpret experiences through language, and people can have different interpretations of the same event or interaction. Number three is having a narrative can help us maintain and organize our reality. So the development of a narrative or a story can help us to make sense of our experiences. And lastly, there is no objective reality. People can have different realities of the same experience. What might be true for us may not be true for someone else. So narrative therapy suggests that we create stories throughout our lives as a way to make sense of our experiences, and we can carry many stories with us at one time. Although some stories can be positive and others negative, all stories impact our lives in the past, the present, and the future. As described in narrative therapy, stories involve the following four elements working together: events, linked in a sequence, across time, according to a plot. There can be many factors that contribute to our development of stories. These factors include how we interpret events or interactions, as well as the meanings we attach to them. Some of those factors might include age, socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, gender, and sexual identity. As we think about these factors, we likely hold beliefs about them and what they mean to us or how they impact us in the world. Our beliefs around these things shape how we might see ourselves and what we tell ourselves about an experience or an interaction. So once someone has been through some type of individual therapy, like for example, narrative therapy, they might want to use their story to go a little further. And this is called storytelling for advocacy. So on this graphic right here, this is called the story arc. And I used the story arc in a group to teach storytelling for advocacy to a women's group. This particular group taught life skills to a group of women. Keep in mind that you would not encourage people still doing the work to heal to use storytelling in this way. Storytelling for healing can look many different ways, but storytelling for advocacy and activism looks much different and is used for different reasons. This is for people who have put in some time healing and may feel sort of on the other side of their trauma. For example, there was a woman in the group who suffered through many adversities in her home country and reported that when she came to Canada, she began a journey of healing and never stopped. Her voice did not shake as she shared with the group. She mentioned it did a few years back. She told us about how she went on to help other women and became a mentor for girls. She did the work, and so she was ready to tell her story in a political forum. She spoke about the torture herself and other women and girls endured and demanded that the government do something to protect women and girls. She also used her storytelling skills in an immigration hearing because this woman was so much more than a file number with RCC. She was a woman with a story who deserved to be heard. So this is basically the framework to construct a story. And this process isn't easy. Like I said, you have to really be past the messy emotions to be able to use your personal story for this type of work. So these are the steps. First, you want to say, who is the protagonist? And that's going to be a person. Where and when is the protagonist at the beginning of the story? What is the inciting incident? So what creates the conflict? And then what's the rising action? What are the complications and barriers that result from the conflict? Number 5 is the climax or the turning point. So what changes the direction for the protagonist? 6, or the falling action, is how does the turning point begin to change the protagonist's life? And number 7 is the resolution, or what has the protagonist gained or learned at the end of the story. 2 really important details to construct a story for advocacy would be a unique and relatable detail, plus 1 piece of data to connect to a bigger story. So that is the formula for a positive story to tell. Let's say you want to apply for funding. Let's say, like I had mentioned earlier, in an immigration hearing, this is the way to construct a story that someone can use. Authentic storytelling is a revolutionary act. We can heal ourselves, others, and even our communities. And when I read that, I think about this. When you stand and share your story in an empowering way, your story will heal you and your story will heal somebody else. When we become empowered, or when we get through something, we start the work of empowering others, oftentimes without even knowing it. A lot of times this happens just through sharing stories with one another. This makes me think of a story, actually. It makes me think of an event like Take Back the Night, and the women who have openly expressed feeling strengthened by the sense of solidarity felt through attending Take Back the Night. As a participant, and then years later as a speaker, I can definitely attest to this. I want to encourage you to think about a time you were moved by a story you heard. Those stories that seem to be put out there just for you that day, because that's exactly what you needed to hear. Have you ever had an experience like that? Stories and the way they are told hold so much power. So, what's your story? I'm wondering, does anyone have a story to share about how they have used storytelling in a social work job or an internship? Or have you heard anything here that inspires you, that you plan to use in future practice? Let me know. What's your story?